I want to start with a description. I'm not going to tell you which period it describes. I want you to guess. The government was on the verge of shutting down, lacking the funds needed for it to operate. Unworthy to represent the people who elected them, politicians had paralyzed Congress with partisan contests. Shootings and stabbings abounded. The United States was eating itself alive. Meanwhile, the media profited from attacking public figures, discouraging anyone of quality from entering politics. That's Charles Dickens, albeit paraphrased, describing the United States in 1842. I find that description striking, not just because it could easily describe what's happening now, but because it tells us something important, that what we're experiencing is not entirely unprecedented. There are patterns to what unfolds in the information environment, patterns that might help us learn how to mitigate problems within it. My name is Alicia Wanless, and this is the Information Animal Podcast. I run the Information Environment Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I've spent the past several years building frameworks to understand how information ecosystems work, not just what's wrong with them, but why they produce the problems they do. If this is your first time joining us, be warned, I have a habit of using imperfect AI outputs in the visual version of this podcast, usually with a dose of scorn. I also like using old propaganda posters. This episode draws on a chapter from my book, The Information Animal, about the decades leading up to the American Civil War. It's a case study in what I call information competition, and I think it has a lot to tell us about the present. Now, all of this comes with a huge caveat that what follows isn't meant to be comprehensive. If you want a deeper dive, check out the chapter. It doubles as a sleep aid. I'm just kidding. But seriously, let's get into it. Information competition is what happens when two or more communities compete to have their worldview adopted by the wider public. They're not just debating, they're competing, using every available tool, every available output to win hearts and minds. When that competition escalates, each side floods the information ecosystem with their version of reality. The goal isn't to persuade, it is to dominate. Now, competition isn't inherently bad, it's the engine of democratic discourse. The problem comes when two worldviews become mutually exclusive, when there's no longer any possible middle ground, when acknowledging any validity in the other side feels like an existential defeat. You can think of information competition as existing along a scale. At one end, homogeneity. Everyone believes the same thing. Not realistic in a large, diverse society, and it's probably not desirable either. Next, coexistence. Different beliefs, but not mutually exclusive ones. Compromise is still possible. This is likely the best state for democracy to function. When beliefs become mutually exclusive and both sides start escalating their efforts to win, you move into confrontation. That tips into conflict, dehumanization, stereotyping, the inability to see the other side as rational human beings. And at the far end of the scale, violence and war. Historically, escalating information competition is a precursor to armed conflict. Across 5 case studies I examined from ancient Greece to today, I found the same patterns. To paraphrase Clausewitz, competitors lock into a duel, two sides striving with informational force instead of physical violence to compel the other to submit. Information competition doesn't necessarily lead to war, but it seems to emerge with a set of changing conditions within an information ecosystem. And the activities and relationships that are prevalent in information competitions tend to repeat time and again. We covered those changing conditions in earlier episodes like What is an Information Ecosystem? And So Cavalier, the early modern English information ecosystem. You can find those episodes on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Now, I'd like to explore those activities and relationships and the information competition leading up to the American Civil War. I think it's an excellent case study. The United States in the 1840s was, by the standards of its time, doing remarkably well. Literacy rates outstripped Britain's. The population was growing by an average of 34% each decade. While pretty homogeneously British, new people were coming from Germany and Ireland who were then marginalized along with Indigenous and African American populations. The telegraph was collapsing, the time it took for information to travel. Newspapers had become cheap and ubiquitous. By the late 1850s, virtually every family in New York was buying a daily paper. The country had common institutions, a shared constitution, a republican tradition. It had all the ingredients of a connected, functioning information ecosystem. And yet, below that surface, it was increasingly becoming two separate information ecosystems inside the same political unit. In the North, education was widespread, near universal adult literacy in New England. Public schooling expanded rapidly, even for girls. A publishing industry was in full bloom. Radical movements were flourishing. Abolition, women's rights, temperance, the telegraph, and cheap printing had dropped the price of newspapers by 2/3 and created institutions like the Associated Press. Hawthorne and Emerson were household names. Thoreau was writing then too. It was an ecosystem that rewarded novelty and more or less had the structural capacity to absorb new and challenging ideas. The South was structurally different in almost every dimension. Most of its publishing was done on northern presses. Its towns lacked the library, lecture halls, and critical infrastructure that the North had in abundance. Literacy rates in the South lagged behind the North, where 3/4 of kids aged 5 to 19 attended school half of the year, compared to just 1/3 in the South, attending on average just 3 months of the year. Information moved more slowly for the most part. There were fewer canals and train lines. Dickens changed his plans for travel in the southern U.S. after learning and experiencing how rough the going was compared to the trips in the North. And critically, the South was deeply invested in keeping certain information out. Abolitionist material was banned from the mail in the southern states. Newspaper editors faced mobs. In 1837, one, Elijah Lovejoy in Alton, Illinois, was killed for his views. Culturally, some in the South saw themselves as distinct, as descendants of the Cavalier supporters of King Charles I in England in its long-ago Civil War, pitted against the Puritans in the North. Now, this was a view nurtured by novels like Cavaliers of Virginia by William Alexander Carruthers in 1834, printed in New York. So here we have one formal political system, two increasingly divergent information ecosystems. And diverging not just in what they believed, but in the structural capacity to engage with information at all. Now, into this system, a fringe minority grew. The abolitionists were at first a tiny group, radical even among Northerners, but they were extraordinarily effective at using available tools. In 1831, Lloyd Garrison opened The Liberator, a newspaper promoting abolition. Frederick Douglass launched the North Star. The abolitionists ran petition campaigns. They flooded Congress with 130,000 appeals demanding the end of slavery in a single legislative session. The Southern response? A gag rule, banning any congressional discussion of those petitions. A classic information control strategy. And it produced exactly the opposite of the intended result. The gag rule handed abolitionists a free speech argument. It gave their campaign a platform it might not otherwise have had. Every attempt by Southern interests to suppress abolitionist ideas gave them a boost. This pattern recurs throughout the chapter in my book, and I'd argue it recurs throughout history. Control strategies don't extinguish information competitions. They put gasoline on them. Event after event followed the same logic. The 1850 Compromise, designed to diffuse sectional tensions, included the Fugitive Slave Act, which compelled citizens in free states to actively participate in returning enslaved people to those who claimed ownership over them. Slavery stopped being a distant abstraction for many people in the North and became a direct personal obligation. Boston textile merchant Amos Lawrence described going to bed old-fashioned conservative compromise union Whigs and waking up stark mad abolitionists. Then, Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, it sold 300,000 copies in its first year and 2 million within a decade, one of the best-selling books per capita in American history. The pro-slavery response? More than a dozen counter-novels arguing that enslaved people lived better lives than northern factory workers, often printed in the North. For every output, a counter-output. For every action, a reaction. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 turned a territory into a battlefield, not just informationally so, but also physically. Both sides funded migration into Kansas to sway the vote on whether it would be a slave or free state. Newspapers were attacked and burned, rifles were smuggled in crates marked books and Bibles, rival governments were established, and violence followed. By this point, both sides had worked themselves into a position where the other's worldview wasn't just wrong, but an existential threat. In the North, Southern slavery was seen as corrupting labor, stifling development, entrenching backwardness. In the South, Northern abolitionism was experienced as a direct threat to physical safety, economic survival, and cultural identity. Fear became the dominant driver. When a drought sparked a fire in Dallas in the summer of 1860, Southern newspapers immediately blamed abolitionists and slave revolts. The story spread across the South via telegraph within days. It wasn't true, but it didn't need to be. People were so primed to react that even a rumor generated a response. What was happening, structurally, was that two information ecosystems were diverging beyond the point of reconnection. Southern attempts to control information flows made Southerners genuinely less exposed to Northern views. The most popular paper in the North, the Tribune, had a circulation of nearly 300,000 in early 1861 and reached only a few hundred people in the South. Attacking journalists, torching newspapers, controlling the mail only made it harder for Southerners to encounter different perspectives. The business model problem also put pressures on editors. They catered to the taste of their audience. As one editor lamented in Raleigh's Lagrange on the 6th of January 1860, the fact is that no man has less freedom allowed him to express his opinions than an editor. His patrons regard him as a penny trumpet through which not a note is to be sounded unless it accords precisely with their own music. Both sides had lost touch with each other to the point of distorted caricature. As historian David M. Potter observed, the North to an image of a Southern world of lascivious and sadistic slave drivers, the South to the image of a Northern world of cunning Yankee traders and rabid abolitionists plotting slave insurrections. This was a tale of two countries, not two separate nations, but one nation with two incompatible realities. When Lincoln was elected in November 1860, Southern newspaper editors were already telling their readers that a Republican victory was tantamount to a declaration of war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, and it became one. So, what does this mean now? What do we take from this? Well, the first thing is, it's not just about technology. The telegraph didn't cause the Civil War. Cheap newspapers didn't cause secession. The ecosystem produced war because of the interactions between people, tools, and outputs and surrounding conditions like educational disparities and the economic structures leading to mutually exclusive ideas. If you're diagnosing today's crisis as primarily a platform problem or an algorithm problem, you're looking at one variable in a very complex system and calling it the cause. Yes, the technology matters, but it doesn't determine outcomes on its own. 2. Information competition is dynamic. Competitors continuously adapt in juxtaposition to each other, much like Clausewitz's ideas on the constant dynamic interaction of adversaries. For every action, there is a reaction, all of them a message to the opponent and public. Effectively, they lock into a duel of ideas long before a conflict erupts. The aim is to have more people adopt your worldview at the expense of your opponent. And to achieve that, competitors adapt to and work within an information ecosystem, knowingly or otherwise, trying to dominate the ideas of their opponent. Yet often, research on information competition looks at a specific campaign in isolation, the tactics and the messaging of a singular actor type, for example, in foreign interference. But information competition is always relational. And 3. Information competition is not isolated. This duel is occurring within a changing information ecosystem. Across the historical case studies I've looked at, each information ecosystem experienced shifts in demographics, literacy levels, new technologies, and the economy at the same time. And with those changes came new ideas that challenged pre-existing ones. Where sharp disparities emerged, where two communities within the same political unit had drastically different informational capacities and exposure, the risk of rupture was much higher. Now, That's not a comfortable framing when the pressures are immediate and the problems feel like they need to be fixed right now.
We have to do something now. But what are we gonna do?
But it does have the advantage of pointing toward the kind of structural analysis that generates interventions with a longer shelf life than whack-a-mole content moderation. The field of information ecology is still new, but it offers something genuinely useful, an approach for connecting the content-level problems many democracies are trying to address to the structural conditions that produce them. Now, that approach is being built on a century of physical ecology research adapted to the information environment. It's testable, it generates hypotheses, it learns from cases. It also connects different types of research. Now, history won't tell us exactly what to do, but it will tell us what not to do. And given the patterns we're watching play out right now, the incompatible realities, the control strategies, the escalating tit for tat, that's not nothing. Now, if this episode made you think differently about what you're seeing in the information environment, please give it a share. And if you want to dig deeper into this topic, then check out my book, The Information Animal: Humans, Technology, and the Competition for Reality. It was published with Hearst and Oxford University Press. For the next episode, we will be switching things up a bit and having some guests. If you don't want to miss it, follow us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Substack. Thank you for tuning in.